Good evening from India. My name is Rajkumar. I'm the founding Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this global virtual conference on reimagining and transforming the future of law schools and legal education. We are, of course, sitting here to be part of the 29th thematic session of the conference on the theme Financial Stability and Sustainability of Law Schools During the Pandemic. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, Professor VESNA CRNIČ-GROTIČ, Dean of the Faculty of Law, University of RIJEKA, Croatia, Professor Dr. Jan von HEIN, Dean of the Faculty of Law, ALBERT-LUDWIGS-UNIVERSITET Freiburg in Germany, Professor Dr. Robin Hickey, Head of the School of Law, Queen's University, Belfast, United Kingdom. We have with us Professor ANAND MISHRA, Director of Law Admissions and Associate Professor of Legal Practice and Associate Dean of Jindal Global Law School here at JGU in India. And of course, I'm grateful to our moderator, Professor Dr. AASHITA DAWER, Associate Professor of Jindal Global Law School. The issue of financial stability and sustainability of law schools and indeed universities has become a very critical issue during this pandemic. There are horror stories from different parts of the world which are emerging in which universities are fundamentally challenged due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Universities and law schools which were dependent on international students' revenue in particular have been adversely affected more significantly. So during these difficult times, there could be no better way than all of us coming together in having this conversation. So with those words, I'm going to hand this panel over to Ashita to take this forward. And I look forward to seeing all of you in the next 55 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raj. I extend a warm welcome to all the panelists. It is a very crucial theme in our times because we had not expected this overnight striking off the pandemic, and we have been suddenly, there has to be transitions which have to be made. So certain thoughts that are there, as Professor Raj was also mentioning, that there have been adverse impacts on institutions, so much so that the institutions have gone into insolvency. The ones who have not gone into insolvency have merely survived and with declined net fixed assets. So also there has been a blanket shift from physical classes to online classes. So this blanket shift in online classes, it seems that they should be cheaper, just as an ebook is cheaper than a regular book. But what happens is that in online classes, the institutions have to suddenly develop a lot of infrastructure to support those online classes. So there is a flip side to it as well. However, if we look at the economy, especially the Indian economy, then we look at the previous year, and during the lockdown, what has happened is that 47% of private investment has gone down. Consumption expenditure has gone down by 27%, and the GDP of India has gone down by 24% from April to June 2020. This unfortunately has an impact on the disposable income of the people, and this reduces the propensity to spend on education by people. So institutions are at the receiving end of that because there is this demand which is there, but there is disposable income which is lesser. And institutions are running at very thin margins and have a lot of fixed costs. But what is interesting is that in these institutions, especially the domestic-based institutions, are facing a lot of domestic demand because of the restriction in the international mobility. So the institutions are also, the law schools have to take up this demand, fill their, cater to them, and that is a good thing. While it's a good thing, it puts a lot of pressure on the financial resources as well. But again, this pandemic can also serve as an opportunity. It can serve as an opportunity to develop infrastructure for the future, for not only the short term and the medium term, but the long term. I will like to ask all of you certain questions, and the first things that come to my mind, I would like all of you to address that, and that is, How are the law schools across the world confronting with this pandemic? What are the adjusting mechanisms? What is the immediate financial impact of this overnight transition to online classrooms? And were there any lessons which were learned from 2007-8 crisis, which could be replicated now suddenly when we faced this shock? So I will like first Professor CRNI쪼-GROTIĆ, then Professor von HEIN, then Professor HICKEY, and then Professor MISHRA to address these questions. I will also request you to take 2 to 3 minutes for each answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashita. Thank you very much. And I would like, of course, to thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in this interesting conference. I am sorry that my first visit to India has to be virtual. I would rather, of course, visit you in person, but that will have to wait for some other times. I come from the city of Rijeka, which is one of the 4 biggest cities in Croatia. We are situated on the coast, and we have a university. We've had it for the last 45 years. So in respect, we are a younger university. We are state-run university, which means that we get all our financing from the state. And that also includes the scholarships for students. So the scholarship is paid by the government, and we receive financing per capita. So depending on the number of students that we enroll, this is our finance. We have actually faced a big drop in the number of students about 3 years ago, which was a bit of a surprise for everybody, but that was the result of a constant, I can call it propaganda if it's not too strong a word, by the government, that students should not enroll in law and economy, because those 2 disciplines are the most popular, have been the most popular disciplines, and the government actually wanted to lower the number of students enrolling in these 2 disciplines. And that is why we faced a drop about 2 or 3 years ago for almost 40% of students. That have affected already our financing, and that already made us turn to alternative sources. Where do we find, and this is really something that is helping us now, because now we already have worked on the alternative resources. Where did we find them? We mostly find them in additional funding from the state. There was the last ministry actually had additional programs that they financed based on the excellence results, if I may call them. So the results in publications, results in student propensity through the dynamic through the school, and also the number of students that enroll with respect to the number of students that finish. So we managed to acquire some additional funds through these programmatic contracts. Furthermore, because we are a member state of the EU, we use the opportunity to get some of the EU-funded projects. So we are now running 2 big for us. I mean, it's about €500,000 euros, 2 projects that we are running. And what is now also paying off is the fact that one of those projects is really student-oriented, student practice-oriented. So we are now using this project to finance additional needs of our students for online studies. So, for example, we were able to finance through this project acquisition of what do you call them, bases for digital bases like the Westlaw or BACS in the German language. So this helps our students and also our staff to be able to get to the digital resources that would otherwise be very difficult to get. And that is because we are able to fund this through this project. So in a way, unlucky and lucky, we were still lucky to be able to be ready to answer to this digital era. I mean, this of course is traumatic in a way for everybody, and our students, although they are mostly able to join us online, but I can also say that they are not very happy about it. So I will perhaps add some more answers in the discussion. Thank you.
Professor Farnham?
Yes, thank you very much. First, let me thank you for inviting me to this splendid and distinguished panel. The basic situation of the University of Freiburg is rather similar to what Professor CRNIČ-GROTIĆ said. We are also a state-run university. Germany is a federal country. We don't have universities that are run by the federal government, but all universities in Germany are run by the state governments and financed by the state governments. So it's a bit of an advantage if you're in the south, in Baden-Württemberg or Bavaria, because these are traditionally the more affluent German states. So our universities are better financed than, say, universities in the northeastern part of the country, because everything depends on the financial resources of the state that runs these universities. So we were in a quite good situation to start with. We are not relying on, or basically not relying on, student fees for students from Germany and the European Union. There are no tuition fees. There are, however, tuition fees for third state nationals, for example, from India or China or Japan. But again, there are numerous waivers for these tuition fees anyway, if you have a partnership agreement with the other institution, so that German students go there and others come to us, then there are usually no fees. It's a source of income, but only to a very modest degree. So that's not something that we're really relying on for our stability. And the third factor is that the University of Freiburg, in relation to its size, is rather strong on third-party funding, both from German sources and from European sources. Adjusted for its size, then we're one of the strongest universities in Germany in this regard, actually. So this is also a rather stable source of income. Nevertheless, there were additional costs associated with the pandemic, because before spring 2020, our universities and other universities in Germany as well were not so strong with regard to digital teaching and all forms of digitalization. So we had to spend some money on buying cameras and buying more laptops for staff who were sent to work in the home office, because we have rather strong data protection regulations in Europe, the general data protection regulation. And then it turned out that, for instance, staff working from the home office could not log into the university system by using their private laptops. And of course, before, not every staff member had their own university laptop. Not every secretary or assistant had this. So we had to really spend some money in the spring to make sure that they could work from home, but at the same time, data protection rules are observed. And we received additional funding for this from the state government. And on the other hand, or in addition, the university reduced in the spring the faculty's budget by 10%. So we suffered a 10% cut. This money was withheld to have a cushion, so to speak, to have some money in the bank if the costs turn out to be higher than expected. But just at the end of this month, now in November, it turned out that the financial the budget plans were quite solid, and at the end of the day, those 10% were paid out to the faculties as well. So there has been some impact on the financial situation, but I think from a comparative view, we are still doing rather well at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor von Hahn. Professor Hickey?
Thank you very much, Ashita. And let me add my thanks to Professor Kumar and to all of you at Jindal for having us and for staging this wonderful event. I think it's a fantastic conference and something very positive to come from these very difficult circumstances. In Northern Ireland at Queen's, we started from a slightly different operating model to the one that my colleagues have identified. So we have three main sources of income. We do receive some state funding for tuition in respect of students from Northern Ireland, but even those students also bear the responsibility to pay some of their own tuition. They're not necessarily paying that directly themselves. They have access to a state-sponsored loans scheme to pay their tuition, but there's a substantial tuition fees liability for students from Northern Ireland or from somewhere else. And so we rely to a very great extent on tuition income for our stability. We also receive some money from the government through the excellence of our research and the scheme like the one Professor CRNIČ-GROTIĆ described. So as we find ourselves reacting to the emergence of the pandemic in the spring, there were really two immediate pressures in terms of costs, and one of those was the operational costs that have already been identified in terms of getting people ready to work from home and getting the campus ready to deliver more virtual teaching. And then we also had the enormous staff costs in doing every other aspect of work remotely, whether that was getting examinations ready to be delivered online or through another means, whether that was offering student support services online, everything from ordinary pastoral interaction right through to support to access library resources and so on. We find enormous staff costs and staff time invested in managing the pandemic. And at the same time, because of that tuition position that I've described, we were immediately looking ahead to student recruitment for this year and thinking about how we could successfully support students to make a choice to come and study with us. And also to think about the content of the degree programs and how that would be affected in the longer run by the pandemic. So both of those things in their own way are about staff time and about the idea that in research intensive law schools, we have to devote an increasing proportion of our time to getting ready for teaching and recruitment. And I can say a little bit more about how we did that, of course, but those were the immediate thoughts in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Thanks, Professor Hickey. Professor Mishra?
Very good evening, everyone. Greetings from Sonipat, all the audience. I will like to give the Indian perspective. And unlike many other countries, India has a rather complex legal education system. We have different type of universities in both the public as well as in the private sector of higher education, and both have different issues. If I look at the public university system, the central universities set up by parliament or the state universities set up by state legislatures, their law departments or their affiliated law faculties are very little affected by this pandemic, frankly. What I learned from my colleagues in, say, University of Delhi or Banaras Hindu University or some other central and state university law faculties, that they're just losing their local travel allowance, which they get otherwise when they come to the campus as a part of their salary. So they are taking classes online from their homes. So they are losing a very so it's not affecting the faculty members, the staff, and the institution as such. But the bulk of Indian higher education, almost 70% of Indian higher education is now in the private sector. And the deemed university and the private universities constitute all those institutions. So we have 1,650 law colleges in India. And out of that, there are only 45 central universities which are having law departments, and another 200-300 state universities having law departments. there is a system of affiliated colleges to state universities, where again they are self-financing and they are facing deep troubles within due to this pandemic within the state university system itself. But the maximum, I will say, crisis has been with many private universities and newly established private and deemed universities. We at Jindal Global Law School and OP Jindal Global University are rather fortunate and blessed in that sense that our university and particularly our leadership was visionary and foresighted enough to guard university against this crisis well in advance. We were among the first institutions to do a lot of things to take care of the situation which was coming. Like our admission process was made online. We made our entrance exam LSAT, an online test overnight. It has, for last 10 years, it was always paper pencil test. But one morning I received a call from my vice chancellor, and he said, in this situation, it's impossible that there could be a paper pencil test, Anand. And we have to talk to LSAC in the US, and we have to immediately get it done online. And thankfully, we were among the first law schools in the country to start classes on 1st of September with the full class in all our programs. So we have not been affected at all by the pandemic in that way, as our students and our faculty members are all, in the teaching learning process. And I will be very candid to tell this, that in our university, and as the university leadership has to be thanked for that, that not a single person from a university professor level to the lowest level staff has lost his or her job or any salary cut or any sort of, and we are handling it well. And I will particularly thank this to the leadership of Professor Rajkumar. But at the same time, I am fully aware that many of our universities are facing deep troubles. The professors are not getting salaries. There have been regular salary cuts since March 2020 in many of the universities. There have been no faculty appointments in many institutions. And there are many other issues being faced. Even the government universities, they could not develop the technical and technological support system. And the most premier of our central universities, they have not been able to start their classes even now, when our first semester is going to be over and exams are going to be announced in the month of December. Our apex institutions, some of the most important central universities, have not been able to start their first semester classes. Rather, they are yet to complete their admission process. So admission has not happened.
I'd like to come in now and pose another question, actually.
Yeah, sure.
And that is a question which I think you will be very interested in answering. Part of it you already did. And I will invite Professor Hickey also to address it. And that is regarding admissions. So basically, what are the challenges that you have faced in reaching out to the students during the pandemic? And related to this, there is a question from the audience which asks that, has the pandemic affected admission of intake of students in the law degrees given the higher fees in law for the law department? So Professor Hickey and then Professor Mishra.
Well, thank you for both of those questions. I think in terms of admissions generally and bringing students into law school, of course, in lots of ways that relies on face-to-face contact and on getting to know the students, whether that's by visiting them in their schools and running sessions and awareness training about what it means to do a law degree, and more about them coming to visit the campus, of course, to get used to the facilities and to imagine what it might be like to be at law school. In the week when the lockdown was announced in the UK, I had been due to travel to South Asia to do a number of school visits and to do some recruitment fairs. And of course, immediately those things are cancelled. And happily, we're able to reproduce quite a lot of that in the online world. And suddenly I found myself very quickly doing a call with 200 or 300 students on Zoom, putting questions up in the chat and asking things about the university. And you could do quite a lot of the information transfer. You can make yourself visible. You could show that you're a happy and friendly person at the other side of the world, waiting to welcome somebody to law school. But I think it's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to reproduce those sense of personal ties and commitment, and to give a really an accurate flavour of what a place is like in a virtual environment like this. And I'm sorry too that my first visit to Jindal Law School is a virtual one, and we feel the weight of that quite keenly. And so the work at that time went into trying to replicate that experience of visiting the campus as far as we possibly could for students. And I think the technology gets us some of the way, but it doesn't get us the whole of the way. And I think whatever happens in the future, campuses and spaces will remain important. In one of the panels yesterday, there was discussion about our buildings as equalizers and as places that lend themselves to social mobility and to inclusion and to support for students. And I think that will always remain the case. And I think that a big challenge of the current admission cycle has been trying to give the students some visibility of that. In terms of our student numbers this year, we haven't really seen an effect here. And I think, AASHITA, that might link in part to the second part of your earlier question about lessons from the previous financial crisis. I mean, I think one of the things that we do seem to see in the context of worldwide downturns is that people turn their thoughts to education and to opportunities to move their skill set on and to think about new ways of contributing. And so I think that there is a bit of an opportunity for law schools to make that contribution and to offer it in a time of crisis. Interestingly for me, we have seen the enrollment on our core law programs, so the different primary law degrees where we're teaching the foundations of legal knowledge subjects. And we've seen the recruitment on those grow across the board, and also really hold steady at the postgraduate side. And so for me, that's exciting. I don't know quite what it means yet, but I think that in the current circumstances, there's going to be an appetite for those kinds of very transferable, very valuable skills that a law degree can give anyone.
Professor Mishra, I'd specifically like to know that one of our audience wants to know that since law degrees are expensive, does that act as a deterrent for people accessing the education in the law school, especially during the pandemic?
So, Professor AASHITA, in Indian scenario, we have different type of law schools. There are different varieties. If we have, say, a Jindal Global Law School, which could be an expensive institution from Indian standards, though if you compare it globally, it may not be. We also have multiple central and state universities which are offering legal education almost free, without any fee. And there is an option to study law for almost any desirous student in our country. Certainly the national law universities and private law schools are expensive for their own valid reasons. But then the central universities, state universities, and their law departments are available for those who are not able to afford the kind of cost. Now, if we look at this pandemic, certainly admissions outreach has been affected, because one of the most important thing for the admissions outreach people was to reach out to students in their place, to organize open house events, to interact with the students and parents in multiple cities. We are a large country, and as a part of our admission outreach system, We used to do open houses and town halls and a lot of even a small interactive sessions in different parts of the country in a physical way. And also, a lot of students and parents want to visit the university campus before investing their 3 years or 5 years of time and money. And that could not happen due to pandemic. So premier institutions like us are not affected as such our admission process. I have seen rather increase in applications in both our LLB and LLM programs. And a bit of, I found due to outreach issues, we were not able to reach out to many cities in physical way by traveling to those places. Certainly our 5-year law program saw a little drop in the applications, and that is attributable to this pandemic. But overall, I believe the premier institutions attract a student from all over, and the students don't care whether it's a pandemic situation or whatever. They join, they study, they go for a premier institution in whichever part of the country, whichever part of the world.
Thank you, Professor Mishra. Professor Von Hahn and Professor CRNI쪼-GROTIĆ, I'd like to ask you a specific question regarding the state funding, that because your universities are state funded, how does the state organize funds? As in, like, do they have enough funds, or is there something like an impact bond, which is used in India, which can be a social impact bond and not a development impact bond, so that the state gets its return as well? So otherwise, like, what is the state funding mechanism? How do they get their funds? Either is that only through taxes, or are there bonds like the way I'm mentioning?
Yeah, well, the state of Baden-Württemberg or other German states is financed by taxes, but also by other income sources when citizens use public facilities, for instance, and have to pay a fee and so on. So it's a very varied system, but the main income source is actually taxes. So I understand your question whether the funding is associated with certain social goals that we have to reach as a university. Well, there are certain laws that oblige us to take into account certain social goals as well. For instance, when it comes to appointments commission and the hiring process, we have to make sure that female applicants, for instance, are adequately considered, and we also have to make sure that we have to increase our male to female staff ratio. So far we have, as in other countries, I think maybe the case as well, more male professors than female professors, which is something that should be adjusted to a near 50-50 level in the future. So we have to justify, for instance, things, and you get certain premiums for certain decisions made by the appointments commission. For instance, when you have when you invite 5 people and 3 of them are women, then you get an extra premium. So the funding is attached with some social goals also relating to other diversity measures. So it's not that the state gives us the money and then we can do what we want. Of course, we are free in our scientific research, so the state does not prescribe us what kind of research we do and what we don't. But with regard to commissions, the administrative process, and so on, there are some social goals that are associated with the funding.
Yes, as I was saying, the system in Croatia is that the schools get funding based on the number of students they enroll, but then the state funds the full scholarship for students who are successful in their work. Because we have this credit system, ECTS, then students who do not fulfill a certain number of ECTS, they have to pay their own scholarship So it depends on their success. So partly they have to bear costs of their own scholarship. It may come to you as a surprise, but actually it's cheaper to study law. The government, the system is based on the costs of studying. So social sciences and humanities are cheap, according to the government standard, because you only need a book, probably. But if you are in medicine, or if you are in the technical sciences or computer sciences, then you need like equipment. So that costs more. So we are a relatively cheap faculty, and we try to attract students based on quality, because the price is the same wherever you go. In Croatia, we have only 4 law schools. They are all state-run. We don't have any private law schools yet, which is a bit surprising, because we have several private schools in economics, but not in law. So I don't know. I'm not sure quite why is it so. We have to say that we have not been affected by the crisis yet, but that is also partly because we are small. So, and we've had not just the crisis of 2007 and 8, we've had crisis of 90s, because we had the war in Croatia. So we have not fully recovered from that when the crisis of 2008 hit, and now we are in a new one. And if I can be sarcastic about it, I mean, if you are always in the crisis, you don't notice when the new one comes. So you are already adjusted to it in a way. And I think this is just one more of those, but this one I think is even worse. We are saving money, funny enough, on travel expenses. That was a huge bulk of our budget, was traveling expenses, because we try to encourage our staff and help our students to attend conferences, international conferences, to participate in international moot court competitions. And all that now has gone online. And so we have no expenses in that part. And we are actually saving money on that we can spend on the costs that have occurred because of the pandemic, such as IT equipment, obviously, but also the equipment that you need for keeping the environment at the faculty still safe in a sanitary manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. The next question that I have is essentially regarding equity. So in terms of staff, many of those who provide operational backbone of the campus, from janitors to food service workers, may lack financial cushion if they are laid off or go unpaid. How can law schools, having their own financial concerns, incorporate a sense of equity? I'd like Professor Mishra and Professor Hickey to address this. So Professor Mishra.
Professor AASHITA, first of all, we need compassionate and university leaders who consider humanity as the most important element in running the university and institutions. So if we have the desire to help people, to help your own staff, your own, from the lowest level, the janitors, university drivers, to the highest level, our professors and deans, the universities may cut cost on other fronts and in other areas, and manage to keep the flock together, to keep their staff, and because everybody is needed. The situation will not remain same. And the campuses are going to open, and the hostels are going to be filled with all the students, and when the classrooms are going to operate in the physical form, everybody is needed. So I think we have handled it very well at Jindal Global Law School and University. And I believe our other private universities in the country and deemed universities, if the management is sympathetic and compassionate and considerate, they can handle it. At the same time, I think because higher education is not just the universities or I mean the responsibility of, actually it's the responsibility of entire society, entire country, entire nation. The universities provide the workforce, and therefore I believe for a situation like COVID-19 or a pandemic-like situation, there should be some COVID relief fund for universities, maybe set up by governments. We have, say, 1,000 universities in India. And if the government could create a fund, a COVID relief fund for universities, providing some money to universities, for COVID measures, that can take care of a lot of discomfort, and also that can save, that can protect jobs of the staff and faculty.
Thank you, Professor Mishra. Professor Hickey?
Well, I just entirely agree with everything that Professor Mishra has said. I think he's put it exceptionally well, and I don't think I can really add very much to it. Compassion is definitely the key word, and I think universities do need to lead with that compassionate tone and response. I would add, I think that it makes a very powerful social impression when that happens. I mean, as Professor Mishra has said, universities play a key role as economic drivers in communities. And I think to be seen to take a compassionate tone with our own staff, to make sure good support arrangements are in place, to make sure good wage systems are in place, and that those articulate with the different responses from government to the circumstances of the pandemic, it's very important that universities do that well. And if universities do that well and are seen to be leaders in their communities, I think there is a more profound social benefit that comes from all of that.
Thank you, Professor Hickey. My next question is regarding financial aids to the students. So, I mean, since it's a pandemic, the institutions are facing losses. How is it that the financial aid is being managed? So I'd like Professor Fonhan and Professor CRNI쪼-GROTIĆ to talk about this.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the pandemic has created financial difficulties for students, although law studies in Germany, apart from or except from our two private law schools in Hamburg and Wiesbaden, is free from tuition. The costs of living in German cities, especially in the larger cities such as Munich, may be quite high, and the pandemic has caused a loss of typical students' jobs. For instance, a lot of students work in restaurants as waiters or waitresses, and since restaurants are now completely closed, those student jobs are no longer affordable. So many students lack a source of income that they have put into their calculation when they took up their studies. And so different programs have been started at the federal level. First of all, the state-owned bank, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, has put on a loan program for students. So students can apply for a loan which covers a sum of up to 650 euros per month. And this is a rather unbureaucratic procedure which has been well received in practice. And for students who are in a acute in a situation of financial necessity, meaning students who have less than 500 euros on their bank account, there is a short and unbureaucratic possibility of receiving interim financial aid. So this is given out as a grant. It's non-refundable. The other source of income is the loan. So at the end of the day, students will have to repay it, but there's no interest on this loan. So it's still financially attractive. And then we have this other source of interim relief for situations of acute financial distress. And it's a situation of, or it's an indicator for the social situation, financial situation of students, that this interim financial aid has been applied for in now 155,000 cases. So that gives you an impression how important it is for students in Germany to receive this additional funding.
Thank you, Professor. Professor CRNIČ-GROTIČ.
Yes, in a way, the situation is similar in like in Germany in terms that students only pay for tuition. So that, and as I said, it's not a very big amount. But if you have students living in another city, then the costs of living are, of course, much higher. There is a system of student homes, like dormitories, that are heavily subsidized by the state. So the costs of living in those dormitories is really not that big. It's less than, well, about, I had my daughter living and studying in Zagreb, so I know a bit about it. It's about 50 to 60 euros per month for a two-bed bedroom. And then the food is also subsidized by the government. So they pay very little, like 2 euros or less for a full meal. And in that respect, it's cheap. If you are a full-time student and if you fulfill your obligations regularly. However, if you lose this track, then you find yourself in a bit of a more difficult situation. And it's mostly parents who subsidize, who finance their children. We don't have a very well-developed system of student loans, and they are not very popular. My university has a system of student loans, but they are really not popular. Nobody likes to take it. But what our university, my university, has is a kind of financial aid for very poor or students who are in a social need. Then they get a certain funding for tuition and for the living costs. But then they have to prove that they really have no income and that their parents have no income. So you really have to be very poor to get this kind of assistance. And then my own school also has a small fund helping students to pay their tuition. So if they also have such a social status that they need this kind of support, we are as a school ready to help them.
Thank you, Professor. I have a question for all of you from the audience. So the question is this, that in a country like India, students struggle financially to afford laptops or good Wi-Fi connection. In the given situation, what role does the college play in providing support to respective students along with their taking care of their own financial needs? So basically access to technology, especially during this pandemic, how is that provided by the college? So I will like to first go to Professor CRNIČ-GROTIČ, then Professor Hickey, Professor Fonhan, and Professor Mishra.
Yes, that's a problem for certain for some students. During the first lockdown in the spring, we had a couple of students who needed help in equipment, so we borrowed. We gave them a laptop, and we helped them with paying the bill for the Wi-Fi, because that came so suddenly. I mean, nobody was expecting it, so we really thought that it's important for these students to receive some kind of assistance. Now we are in a second wave. So in the meantime, students had the chance to, organize themselves and to find other resources. So now the demand is still there, but rather low, and we are ready to borrow the equipment and to help them with the financial aid. Of course, we are talking about very few students, so that is something that we can afford to do. If it were a bigger number, then of course we don't have special resources just for that, and that would be somewhat difficult. Thank you.
Professor Hickey?
Well, it's a very important question, isn't it? And our response was the same. We loaned laptops and other computer hardware to students. We made sure we had a system to manage that and to make sure that students had access to the support. I think that the second piece of the puzzle relates back to my earlier comment about our buildings as levelers and remaining important during these times. I mean, so in Northern Ireland today, we've begun another 2-week lockdown. As part of that, universities were asked to do as much of their teaching as was possible online. So face-to-face instruction is only happening where it's absolutely necessary. But we have been able to keep our buildings open. We've kept our libraries open, socially distanced with precautions in place. There are study spaces in the campus that students can access. And of course, the Wi-Fi is likely to be better quality on the campus. And I think it's really important that we retain that sense of the availability of the campus and the facilities of the campus, even in a world where lots of the instruction is happening in a virtual space. So just because the tutorial is on Zoom doesn't mean that the university is closed. And I think that the university retains that sort of social and teaching leveling function. The other thing that I'm reminded of is that had any of this happened even 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been much harder to keep going. I mean, Zoom is available on a phone, Teams is available on a phone. Almost all of us have smartphones these days, wherever we are in the world. And at least it is more possible than ever to interact with each other in a live and constructive way, just like we're doing at the moment. So thank goodness it's happening now in some respects.
Professor Vonha?
Yeah, well, the students bring their own laptops as they did before. I mean, Germany is still comparatively a fairly affluent country, so even before the pandemic, most students had their own laptops. I have to say that in many cases they have more modern MacBooks than I myself have at my disposal. But so this is not such a big problem. Of course, it may be a problem for students in a situation of financial distress. I recognize that fully, but in this regard, we have those programs that I already mentioned, the loan program by this federal state bank and the additional financial interim aid. And of course, this money cannot be spent only on rent or food, but requiring a new laptop to follow the courses may, of course, be another situation which creates a financial necessity, so you can pay then by these loans and interim financial aid for such purposes as well. So this is taken care of. We had originally tried in the fall term this year to offer a kind of hybrid learning environment for our first year students, because we had the intention of providing at least first year students with actual courses, seeing a living professor in front of them. But then when we started our term, the rate of infections in Germany had already reached such high levels that we have to give up those plans. So when we started the fall term, everything was back to complete online teaching as well. And in this regard, problem may occasionally be that the Wi-Fi transmission rate may not be sufficiently high enough for students to follow the courses, because they're at home as well. And if there are, for instance, 5 or 6 students living in a flat in Freiburg and they're sharing the same access point and everyone at Monday on 10 has an online course to follow, this may occasionally be difficult. So this has also triggered a discussion in Germany that we need to improve our general standard of digitalization, because although Germany is a fairly affluent country, here we are still behind in many areas, behind other EU member states. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Mishra?
See, in Indian context, I feel we can handle this issue from both university or college or higher education institution side, as well as from the government side. I strongly believe, like the way Uttar Pradesh government, one of our state governments, if you remember in past, they distributed laptops to almost every student who passed class 12 exam and went to a university. So in a similar way, I think the university students, whichever university they are studying in, those who come from economically weaker section, those who are having their below poverty line certificates, which are issued by the government in our country, those students, the government should intervene and provide them technological support so that their studies are not discontinued, they are able to attend classes, they're able to take exams and all that. From university or college side, the best way is to enrich your computer center. I was in University of Delhi, and it had a very rich Delhi University Computer Center with hundreds of terminals available for student use. So institutions can create public computer centers, and maintaining social distancing, students who are in the vicinity can use that facility if they do not own their own laptops for the time being. And also it's true, I mean, in today's time, almost every university student has a smartphone, and the data is also not that expensive. So if you have a desire to learn, to attend classes, I don't think technology or the Wi-Fi and those things become an issue.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Mishra. And in fact, I'm going to take cue from you for my last question, last thoughts, which I'd like you to present in just under a minute. And what do you think should the role of the government be, especially considering the fact that the law schools are facing financial crunch, and on the other hand, the aggregate income of people is also going down. So what do you think the role of the government should be? Under a minute response from each one of you, that would be great. Professor Von Hahn?
Yeah, well, I think that the government should support the law schools, because in a situation like this, in a time of pandemic, there are a lot of legal difficulties, and I think that we will need very good lawyers during the pandemic and also after the pandemic to sort out all the problems that the pandemic has caused for the fulfillment of contracts and other situations as well. So I think it would be very short-sighted to cut the funding of law schools precisely at this moment.
Professor Mishra?
Professor AASHITA, I think what I told earlier, there should be a dedicated COVID fund for universities, which could be set up by government, by Ministry of HRD and Ministry of Education now. And even the state governments can do similar things for their own institutions. The other thing I feel, the CSR funds, the corporate social responsibility funds, which come from the corporates, some part of it should be reserved for universities and higher education institutions, not just law schools, but the entire higher education, because the higher education institutions provide the workforce, the manpower, the professionals who go and make profits for all these corporations. So the CSR funds, I feel universities have a genuine claim that at least 10% of, say, the CSR liability of a company should be going to universities, and whether it support financial aid for a student, whether it institutes scholarships, whatever fund. In India, we have 50,000 crores in CSR funds in previous years, and it has potential to rise up to 1 lakh crores. So out of 50,000 crores, even if 10% is given to higher education universities, you can get 5,000 crores. And every university can get 50 crores that way.
These are very interesting thoughts, Professor Mishra. I'd like to go to Professor CRNI쪼-GROTIĆ and then Professor Hickey.
Yes, thank you. Well, as we are part of the public service body, then of course the government is going to take care of us for as long as they can. I mean, there will probably be some reductions in funding because obviously on the income side, the government is suffering great losses. But when I look at the private sector, what the government is trying to do is trying just to assist them with the paychecks, which of course affects our student body, because their parents receive less money, and then of course they can't afford to study, and that will affect also us in the public sphere. But the government is claiming that they can't afford to do much more than that, so they will give a substitute or subsidize a pay for each employee. But that is not, I mean, it's just a money to survive, but not really a money to do much more. And that will affect us in the next phase.
Professor Hickey, quick thoughts, left with no time.
Well, and I agree, of course, that government support matters. If I can answer the question the other way around, I think it also falls to us as university leaders to make the case to government. We know the economic benefits that follow from law degrees, and we know the appetite for our courses at the minute. And I think there's a very important moment for us to sustain the future of law school education, university education generally, by taking every opportunity we can to convince government that research and development, education, these things matter and are worth funding.
Thank you, everyone. It was a very interesting session. I learned a lot. I hope the audience also learned a lot. I'll give the platform to Professor Rajkumar.
Thank you so much, Ashita, and thank you, Professor HEIN. It was a fascinating discussion because what each one of you brought to bear in this discussion is a very critical component of why should funding and financial stability of law schools need to be assured, and what are the ways by which we can secure the future of law schools by strengthening the financial governance of law schools in the pandemic and beyond. I'm grateful to you for your time and indeed your participation in this conference. Be well and take care.